Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. This week, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the nutrients that make up our soil and why those are so important in our forage production. So, last week, when we looked at your soil test and what it's like when it comes back, it went through the different nutrients and how much you had of each one of them. And when we talk about why that's important, it's important that we understand the law of the minimum. This basically is telling us that the plant can only grow to the least available factor. Those factors could be anything like those essential nutrients that we're going to talk about today: water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, temperature, and a few other things. But that means even if your nitrogen levels are really high, you might be pouring all the urea you can into the ground. If your pH is low or if there's not enough phosphorus or potassium, you still won't get the results that you want. And that's another reason why our soil testing is so important. So that way we know what those levels are so we can reach those levels we need to reach. So, what are those nutrients that are required? We started talking a little bit about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium last week. When we look at fertilizers, lots of times you're used to seeing the NP and K values, and we know the other three come from the atmosphere. Some of the secondary nutrients that we can always check to see if there's any kind of issue are things like calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then there's also a few other micronutrients that sometimes we look for to make sure that there's not a deficiency in these as well. NP and K are your big three. So when you look at a bag of fertilizer, if it says triple 13, for example, that's the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that are found in that fertilizer. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. So it's important to realize that nitrogen is a major part of the amino acids, which are the building blocks of those proteins. Nitrogen is key in all of our amino acids. These are the building blocks of proteins. It's the one that our plants use the most. And so that's why most people are used to applying that nitrogen fertilizer. When we talk about hay production, we may even come back with nitrogen fertilizer after each cutting to give it that boost that it might need. Phosphorus is another essential component of our energy currency when it comes to cells. And it's also a big component of DNA. So we want to make sure that there's plenty of phosphorus available to our plants. And then we get to potassium, which is the K. That confuses a few people. And this is what activates those enzymes that help our plant function like it needs to. If we're looking at any kind of drought weather or winter hardiness or things that are going to be difficult for that plant, we want to make sure that it has plenty of potassium available so that it can adapt to those conditions. Some of those other nutrients we talked about a little bit are things like calcium. This is what helps build those cell walls so that membranes can let everything flow through the plant cell as it needs to. We need magnesium, we need sulfur. So when we look at nutrient deficiencies, we can look at those key nutrients and see if we're missing something that we need. It's also important to realize you could have a deficiency or you could have a toxicity. If your soil test comes back and tells you to put out 200 pounds per acre, 400 pounds per acre will not necessarily be better. You could push it to the upper limit. So if we look at nitrogen, if it has really light green leaves, your growth seems to be stunted, it's not putting on fruit like you think it should, that could be a sign that it's deficient. Whereas the other side, if those leaves are a darker green than what you expect them to be, that could be a sign that you've hit toxic levels of nitrogen. We can also see those nutrient deficiencies in some of our micronutrients. Zinc is something we commonly see, especially in some of our gardens. If your plants are still yellowing on their younger leaves, they seem to be stunted, they're not coming to maturity, that could be a sign that they're zinc deficient. And this is just another reason why it's so important to have those soil tests done so that we can know exactly what the problem is so we know how to target it. So let's look at a hayfield. When we talk about fertilizing for hay production, it's important that you realize how much nutrients are coming off of the ground when you're cutting that field for hay. So, for example, this is how many pounds per ton is removed when you take a hay bale off that field. Here in Hot Spring County, we've got mostly Bermuda grass hay fields. We may have some other warm season mixed in there like Bahia grass, but we'll look at Bermuda as our example. For every ton of dry matter of hay, you're taking off 42 pounds of nitrogen, 42 pounds of phosphorus, and 48 pounds of potassium. And that may not sound like a whole lot, but when we look at fertilizer prices, let's say I talked to a guy this week and he was in square hay production and he plans to produce 6 tons per acre of Bermuda square hay. When you look at what fertilizers cost last week here in Hot Spring County, you're looking at taking off 476 pounds of urea per acre, 480 pounds of potash, and 183 pounds of DAP per acre. that can add up to over $250 per acre of fertilizer that's being removed from the field. And that's why it's so important that we take the time to fertilize back into our fields that we're using for production to keep those soil levels where they need to be so that we can stay in production. So when we talk about those three numbers, we mentioned earlier triple 13. Right now you can go to the co-op and buy triple 19. But a lot of people don't understand what do those numbers really mean. What's the difference in buying triple 19 versus buying urea and DAP? And it all comes down to how much of each nutrient is in there. Those three numbers represent the amount of N, P, and K for every 100 pounds of bulk material. So for this example, we're looking at triple 17, for example. That means for every 100 pounds of material, you're getting 17 pounds of nitrogen, 17 pounds of phosphorus, and 17 pounds of potassium. Whereas a 10, 20, 10 would have 10 pounds of nitrogen, 20 pounds of phosphorus, and 10 pounds of potassium. So when your soil test comes back and it tells you how many pounds of each one of those you need, this is how you convert it to how much of each fertilizer you need. And that's where we come in as extension and we can help you figure that out. I always make those notes on the bottom of soil test reports for my folks. That way you've got an idea of what you're spending and what kind of fertilizer do you need. Depending on those levels of potassium and phosphorus in your soil, sometimes a triple 19 or a triple 17 can be a great resource, but other times you don't need that in the same ratios. And that's why we've got different options when it comes to fertilizers. So when we look at what those common fertilizer materials are, to give you an idea of what you're looking for, keep in mind these are all in addition to some of our triple 13s or triple 19s that are out there, to give us those options of playing with it to find the fertilizer we need for our fields. So ammonium nitrate is a 3400. That means for every 100 pounds of fertilizer, you're getting 34 pounds of nitrogen. Urea is a 4500. DAP is the diammonium phosphate is 18460. Potash is the other common we use at 0060. So if we can use urea, DAP, and potash, we can form those together to get that custom blend that meets your soil test recommendations without going above or below anything else. Just like when you're shopping, it's also important to look at the cost of each one of these. Maybe it is cheaper and your ratio came back at 10, 12, 10. So a triple 19 is economically feasible for you. We've got options that way we can find the right one for your operation. If you're having trouble figuring out what kind of fertilizer you need for your fields, don't hesitate to reach out and give me a call. We'll start with a soil test and we'll go from there to make sure you're going to be at the right nutrient levels for your operation. Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about fertilizers and some of those sources you can get. We'll see you next Friday.